In 1999, a girl's car sat untouched in her driveway while her prom dress hung waiting in the window. 10 years later, when they opened that car's trunk, the truth shattered everything her town thought they knew. If Melanie's story left you searching for answers, help us keep her memory alive. Like, subscribe, and join us as we uncover the mysteries that should never be forgotten. It was the kind of street where time seemed to hold its breath. Elm trees casting long shadows across neat sidewalks. Wind chimes whispering stories only the breeze could understand. In the spring of 1999, this neighborhood was like any other small-town enclave. Steady, uneventful, cradled by routine. Children played after school. Garden hoses hissed across cracked driveways. And for most of May, porch lights burned long into the night, waiting for someone who never returned. On the corner of Primrose Lane stood a modest, blue-trimmed house with white shutters and a mailbox that had once been painted with flowers, now faded by sun and time. The driveway next to it remained curiously undisturbed. A pale green Honda Civic was parked there, as it always had been, aligned neatly, unmoved. To a passing eye, it seemed unremarkable. But those who lived nearby noticed something strange. The car hadn't moved in days. Then weeks. The tires began to soften, slightly. Rain left streaks across its windshield like fingerprints. And the passenger window gathered a thin film of dust, the kind that only comes with waiting. Inside the house, a yellow satin dress hung delicately on the back of a bedroom door. Its sequins caught the morning light and scattered it like fallen stars across the floor. It had been carefully chosen, pressed, altered, loved. The matching heels sat beneath it, untouched. A corsage, sealed in a plastic box, had long since wilted inside the refrigerator. The name on the prom ticket was Melanie Whitaker. She was 17, a senior, bright, quiet, but not withdrawn. The kind of girl teachers remembered for her handwriting precise and slanted, like she was always writing at an angle to the world. Her classmates described her in fragments, kind, a little mysterious, always scribbling in the margins of her notebooks. She wasn't unpopular, just elusive, like someone already halfway out the door. On May 15th, she was expected to attend her senior prom. She never showed up. The town held its breath for a while. At first, there was worry, then concern, and then something colder, resignation. Her friends clung to hope. Her family didn't speak to the media. Police issued a standard missing persons alert, but with no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, and no concrete leads, her case quickly dissolved into the fog that swallows most quiet disappearances. The Civic remained parked in the same spot, a pale green tombstone for a life paused mid-sentence. In time, life went on. New families moved into nearby homes. The local high school repainted its gym, but that car remained. Neighbors whispered about it, always in passing, always half-lowered voices. "That's Melanie's," someone would murmur while pulling weeds or walking a dog. No one touched it, no one dared. It became an artifact, a silence preserved in metal and rubber. Years passed. The driveway cracked with time. Moss crept along the edges. The car became invisible to those who didn't know, and haunting to those who did. No one knew what it held, no one asked. But in the hush of early mornings, when dew clung to the grass and wind stirred the curtains inside that still bedroom, it was hard not to feel it, that heavy, aching absence. A girl had vanished. Not loudly. Not violently. She simply didn't arrive. No note, no calls, no tire tracks. Just a prom dress and a car that never moved. It was the kind of street where time seemed to hold its breath. Elm trees casting long shadows across neat sidewalks. Wind chimes whispering stories only the breeze could understand. In the spring of 1999, this neighborhood was like any other small-town enclave. Steady, uneventful, cradled by routine. Children played after school. Garden hoses hissed across cracked driveways. and for most of May, porch lights burned long into the night, waiting for someone who never returned. On the corner of Primrose Lane stood a modest, blue-trimmed house with white shutters and a mailbox that had once been painted with flowers, now faded by sun and time. The driveway next to it remained curiously undisturbed. A pale green Honda Civic was parked there, as it always had been, aligned neatly, unmoved. To a passing eye, it seemed unremarkable. But those who lived nearby noticed something strange. The car hadn't moved in days. Then weeks. The tires began to soften, slightly. Rain left streaks across its windshield like fingerprints. And the passenger window gathered a thin film of dust, the kind that only comes with waiting. Inside the house, a yellow satin dress hung delicately on the back of a bedroom door. Its sequins caught the morning light and scattered it like fallen stars across the floor. It had been carefully chosen, pressed, altered, loved. The matching heels sat beneath it, untouched. A corsage, sealed in a plastic box, had long since wilted inside the refrigerator. The name on the prom ticket was Melanie Whitaker. She was 17, a senior, bright, quiet, but not withdrawn. The kind of girl teachers remembered for her handwriting precise and slanted, like she was always writing at an angle to the world. Her classmates described her in fragments, kind, a little mysterious, always scribbling in the margins of her notebooks. She wasn't unpopular, just elusive, like someone already halfway out the door. On May 15th, she was expected to attend her senior prom. She never showed up. The town held its breath for a while. At first, there was worry, then concern, and then something colder, resignation. Her friends clung to hope. Her family didn't speak to the media. Police issued a standard missing persons alert, but with no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, and no concrete leads, her case quickly dissolved into the fog that swallows most quiet disappearances. The Civic remained parked in the same spot, a pale green tombstone for a life paused mid-sentence. In time, life went on. New families moved into nearby homes. The local high school repainted its gym, but that car remained. Neighbors whispered about it, always in passing, always half-lowered voices. "That's Melanie's," someone would murmur while pulling weeds or walking a dog. No one touched it. No one dared. It became an artifact, a silence preserved in metal and rubber. Years passed. The driveway cracked with time. Moss crept along the edges. The car became invisible to those who didn't know, and haunting to those who did. No one knew what it held, no one asked. But in the hush of early mornings, when dew clung to the grass and wind stirred the curtains inside that still bedroom, it was hard not to feel it, that heavy, aching absence. A girl had vanished. Not loudly. Not violently. She simply didn't arrive. No note, no calls, no tire tracks. Just a prom dress and a car that never moved. After Melanie vanished, the town changed in ways that were almost invisible at first. Conversations became shorter, smiles dulled, and a silence crept in like mist, not loud or sudden, but steady and smothering. For the first few days, her disappearance was everything. It dominated whispers in grocery aisles, filled the pews of Sunday sermons, and hovered over school hallways like smoke after a fire. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had something to say. But then, slowly, they didn't. It wasn't just the uncertainty, it was the absence of a conclusion. There was no body, no note, no headline to end it with. No scene outlined in police tape, no answers sealed in autopsy reports. It was an unraveling with no final thread to tug. And so, the speculation began. Whispers that Melanie had eloped with someone older, someone secret. That she'd cracked under pressure, fled to the city, dyed her hair, changed her name. Others went darker. Talk of strangers passing through, of headlights seen near the orchard late that night. But all the stories had one thing in common. They were told only once or twice, and then tucked away, like something shameful. After the summer heat faded into the rust-colored chill of autumn, people stopped talking about Melanie altogether. At school, her locker remained untouched for weeks. Some students left flowers inside. Others, notes scribbled in pencil on notebook paper, folded small, written like apologies. Eventually, the janitor emptied it quietly, after hours. The yearbook committee debated whether to include her photo in the senior section. In the end, they did. A single picture, smiling, surrounded by names that would go on to graduate, to leave town, to live lives that Melanie would never see. But her parents stayed. They refused to move, refused to paint over her room or clear out her closet. The Whitaker house became a monument to stillness. Through the windows, you could see the living room always clean, always dimly lit. Holidays came and went without decorations. The porch light remained on every night, like a signal she might still come home. Strangers would pass by and feel something catch in their throats, a weight they couldn't name. Grief that didn't look like grief, just a house too orderly, too suspended in time. Her bedroom remained exactly as it had been that May evening. The yellow dress still hung from the closet door, slowly gathering dust in the folds. On her dresser, a dried-out bottle of perfume sat beside a stack of books, Wuthering Heights, A Wrinkle in Time, Into the Wild. The pages had begun to curl with humidity. Her journal, untouched, lay open to a page with a single sentence scrawled in looping pen. I feel like something is coming. Outside, the Civic remained parked on the edge of the driveway, just under the shadow of the mailbox. The paint dulled, the windshield streaked from years of rain. The tires slowly sagged into the earth. At first, it was a focal point. People stared at it when they passed. Some even left flowers on the hood. But in time, they looked away. It was easier that way. It was a year of silence, of rituals unspoken, of eyes avoiding eyes. And behind all of it was a truth the town didn't want to touch, that Melanie Whitaker had simply vanished. And nothing, not prayers, not rumors, not time had brought her back. By 2009, the world had changed in ways both subtle and seismic. Cell phones had become extensions of the body. Gas prices had soared and dipped, and students at the local high school no longer remembered Melanie Whitaker as a classmate, only as a cautionary tale passed down in hushed tones. But on the edge of Primrose Lane, there was one thing that refused to change: the pale green 1996 Honda Civic. It remained precisely where it had always been, its tires swallowed now by the earth, its edges blurred by overgrown grass. The driveway beneath it had cracked and crumbled, the concrete slowly giving way to roots and moss. But the car, unchanged, unmoving, waited. Neighbors no longer stared at it. Over time, they trained themselves not to see it at all. It became part of the scenery, like a crooked fence post or a rusted wind chime. Children riding their bikes would speed up slightly when passing the Whitaker house, even if they didn't know why. Something about it felt too still, too permanent. The car seemed immune to time, as if untouched by the elements that aged everything else around it. The paint, while faded, never chipped. The windshield never cracked. Even the license plate remained legible, though the registration had long expired. No one dared to move it. At first, it was respect. A shared grief that kept people from tampering with what had become a silent memorial. But eventually, it was bureaucracy. The title was still in Melanie's name. Her parents never signed it over, and legally, the vehicle was in limbo. The town considered towing it once. Just once. A man from the city came out with a clipboard and a camera, circled the car, knocked on the Whitaker's door. No one answered. He left and never came back. The paperwork was buried somewhere in a filing cabinet, never followed up on. And so the Civic sat, an artifact of a frozen moment, a sealed chapter no one could bear to open. Dust clung to the windows in thick layers. Leaves blew across the hood and gathered in the wheel wells each fall. In winter, the snow blanketed it like a shroud. In summer, The sun baked its interior, warping the dashboard, curling the edges of something that sat unnoticed in the back seat. A crumpled sweater, the kind worn on cool, May evenings. Then, one late summer morning, in 2009, everything shifted. It was a Tuesday. The kind of day no one remembers on its own mild sun. The smell of freshly cut grass lingering in the air. A city worker had been tasked with cataloging abandoned vehicles throughout residential zones. Budget cuts, enforcement tightening, a push to clean up the streets. As the mayor had put it in a speech no one really paid attention to. The worker, clipboard in hand, made his way down Primrose Lane and paused when he saw the Civic. Not because he recognized it, but because it looked like it had been forgotten, like something time had overlooked. He jotted down the make and model, snapped a photo, and walked toward the passenger side. That's when he noticed the film on the windows, the fingerprints in the dust. Not smudges but singular, deliberate marks. One, on the inside of the glass. He crouched, peered through the front windshield, and saw nothing but shadows. Then, moving around to the back, he caught the glint of something metallic through the haze of dirt on the rear window. Just for a second, just enough to make him stop, stare, and feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He called it in. Not because he was certain of what he saw, but because the silence around that car suddenly felt too loud, too careful. As if something had been waiting, watching. And just like that, the Civic was no longer invisible. It was the center of everything again. The morning had been uneventful until that moment. The city worker had already logged 6 abandoned cars by the time he made his way to the end of Primrose Lane. He was young, not from the area, and had never heard the name Melanie Whitaker. To him, the pale green Civic was just another forgotten vehicle, one of many that had overstayed its welcome on residential property. He stepped over the cracked driveway, clipboard in one hand, camera in the other. The distant hum of sprinklers filling the silence. His boots crunched the gravel as he circled the vehicle, scribbling down the license plate number, noting the flattened tires, the dense vegetation curling up around the undercarriage. It was textbook derelict. He lifted his camera and snapped a photo of the side, then the front. When he moved to the back of the car, he squinted through the grime-coated rear window. That's when he saw it. Just for a moment, a flicker, a reflection of something metallic inside the trunk. At first, he assumed it was debris, a piece of broken equipment, maybe a leftover tool. But as he adjusted his angle, trying to make out the shape, the light hit it again. It was too clean, too sharp-edged to be trash. Something about it didn't belong. He stepped back and hesitated. Protocol dictated that he tag the vehicle and report it, not touch anything. But something in his gut urged him forward. He tapped on the trunk once, it didn't budge. Then again, harder. Nothing. The lock was corroded, fused by time and weather. He looked around, no one was watching. The house was still, the street empty. He slipped a small crowbar from the back of his truck and returned to the Civic. It took several minutes of prying, the metal groaning in protest, reluctant to give up its secrets. Then, with a sickening pop, the latch broke. The trunk creaked open a few inches, releasing a breath of air that had been trapped for a decade. Stale, thick, and laced with something far older than mildew. He gagged. The scent clung to his throat, dry and sour, like the inside of an old cellar. He hesitated again. Then, slowly, he lifted the lid the rest of the way. Inside was silence. Dense, coiled silence that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. At first, all he saw was a dark blanket, matted, stiff, and stained in places. Then, something beneath it. A curve of bone, a sliver of a jaw. Teeth, still intact. The outline of a human form, fetal and folded. He stumbled backward, dropping the crowbar, the sound of it clanging against the concrete, jolting him back into motion. His hand went instinctively to his radio. He called dispatch, his voice shaking, barely audible. The Civic was no longer just a car. It was a coffin, a time capsule sealed by grief and rot and secrecy. And next to the remains, tucked against the wheel well, sat a single, high-heel, yellow satin, dulled and brittle. A corsage, flattened and fossilized in a plastic box. And one more thing. A sealed envelope, aged and fragile, with faded ink scrawled across the front. It read simply, "Mom." The worker didn't touch it, he couldn't. Instead, he stood there, rooted in place, as the sound of approaching sirens grew louder in the distance. What had once been a mystery, shelved and forgotten, had just split open. And the truth, long buried in silence, began to seep through the cracks. When the forensic team arrived, the morning sun was already climbing high, casting elongated shadows across the driveway where the Civic sat, its trunk yawning open like a wound. The street had been cordoned off, and curious neighbors peered from behind curtains and screen doors, their morning routines quietly dissolving under the weight of something they could not yet name. No one had spoken the words out loud, but everyone seemed to know. Somehow, they had always known. Inside the trunk, the skeleton was curled into itself, knees drawn upward, arms bent in a protective posture, as if even in death, the figure had tried to shield itself from something unbearable. Years of decomposition had reduced the body to clean, pale bones, some of them displaced slightly by time and gravity, others still held together by the tatters of what had once been formal wear. A thin scrap of black fabric clung to the ribcage. It may have once been a suit jacket. Nearby, pressed flat against the trunk lining, was a boutonniere dried and discolored, but unmistakable. The flowers, once cream or maybe white, had browned at the edges like burned paper. The pin that had held it in place was rusted, its tip embedded in the deteriorated cloth. The single high heel was unmistakably feminine, pale yellow, matching the prom dress that still hung undisturbed in Melanie Whitaker's bedroom. The leather had cracked, and the heel was slightly bent, but the shoe was otherwise intact. Its placement in the trunk separated from the skeleton, as though it had fallen or been thrown, only deepened the unsettling sense that whatever happened here had not been quiet or kind. Investigators moved carefully. Every item was catalogued, photographed, bagged. But one object brought them to a halt. A sealed envelope, yellowed and brittle with age, lying beneath the edge of the blanket that had been draped over the remains. It was unmarked, except for a date scrawled in careful handwriting across the center. May 15, 1999. The very night Melanie was supposed to go to prom. The ink was slightly smudged, faded in places, but legible. A second line, just beneath the date, had been added with a lighter hand. Mom. The handwriting was smooth, rounded. A teenager's hand. Inside the envelope, the paper was fragile, folded into thirds, and sealed with a piece of aging Scotch tape. Investigators debated whether to open it immediately or preserve it for the lab, but in the end, they chose caution. The letter was placed into an archival sleeve and locked into evidence, but its presence told a story that words had not yet revealed. Whoever had been left in that trunk, whoever they had been with, had intended that note to be found. It wasn't tossed in haste or carelessness. It was deliberate, like a final breath written in ink. By the time the remains were carefully removed from the Civic, the sun had begun its slow descent. The trunk was empty again, but the air around it remained charged, heavy with everything that had finally surfaced. DNA testing would take time, but the conclusion had already taken root in everyone's mind. Melanie hadn't disappeared. She had been here the whole time, sealed in metal, wrapped in secrets, waiting for the light to catch on something just right. And now, after 10 years, she had spoken again. Not with sound, but with bones and a bow tie. And with a letter that waited still unopened to answer questions that had haunted a town for a decade. The letter was opened in a controlled environment, under the soft glow of museum-grade lighting and the careful hands of a forensic archivist. It had been sealed for 10 years, buried with dust and silence inside the trunk of a car no one dared disturb. The envelope, fragile and discolored, peeled open reluctantly, as if it, too, had absorbed the weight of everything left unsaid. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed at the corners, the ink slightly faded but legible. The handwriting was unmistakably Melanie's, round, looping, a little hurried, as though she had written it quickly but with purpose. It began simply, "Mom, I'm sorry." The words looked almost childlike in their sincerity, but what followed erased any innocence that might have lingered on the page. Melanie wasn't running from home. She wasn't rebelling or collapsing under the weight of adolescent pressure. She had been running toward someone she thought she could trust, someone who had promised her escape. The next lines were disjointed, fragments that read more like confessions than explanations. She mentioned someone she had been seeing secretly, an older man, not from town. He had a job that kept him moving, a story for every town he passed through, and a way of speaking that made her feel like she mattered. No one else had ever made her feel that way. He listened, she wrote. He understood. At least, that's what she believed then. But there were signs. He didn't want to meet her parents. He didn't want her friends to know. He told her they were different, that their love was something too big for a small town to understand. He said she was brave, that leaving everything behind would prove it. He told her to meet him after work on prom night. He said they would leave together and never look back. The letter turned darker near the end. Her writing grew shaky, inconsistent. There were smudges where the ink had run, perhaps from her hand, or perhaps from tears. She wrote that she had second thoughts, that as she drove, something inside her screamed to turn around. But when she got to the place they agreed on, a spot just past the orchard near the county line, he was already there, and he wasn't alone. She didn't know the other man, only that something felt off, that the smile he gave her was wrong, that the way her secret whispered her name no longer felt tender. It felt like a warning she'd failed to hear in time. She didn't write what happened next. The letter ended not with a goodbye, but a pause. A final line, underlined twice. If something happens, it's not an accident. And then her name. Melanie. Reading the letter was like unlocking a door, only to find more darkness behind it. It didn't tell the full story, but it lit the path. Someone had taken advantage of her trust. Someone had lured her out that night with promises they never meant to keep. She wasn't lost. She was intercepted. And someone, maybe more than one person, had made sure she never arrived. For a decade, people had spoken of her disappearance in past tense, as if she had slipped away of her own volition. But the letter turned that notion to ash. It was never a vanishing. It was an erasure. Carefully orchestrated, brutally final. And in the end, she had tried to leave something behind, not just a body in a trunk, but a truth no one had wanted to see. Not until now. For years, there had been a void in the story, a missing piece no one could define, just a gnawing sense that something had been overlooked. In the weeks after Melanie disappeared, police questioned friends, family, classmates, even casual acquaintances. Everyone agreed on one thing. Melanie hadn't mentioned anyone new. No boyfriend. No fight. No strange behavior that would signal something was wrong. But then came the letter. And with it, the name no one had spoken before. It wasn't a full name, just the first, written once in the middle of a paragraph and never repeated. Caleb. A name so common, it nearly dissolved into the rest of the page. No address, no last name, no identifying details, beyond a vague description of someone who made her feel like the world was larger than what surrounded her. But the investigators clung to it. It was the only thread they had, and they pulled it carefully, slowly, knowing any sudden movement might snap it. They started in the places Melanie had mentioned in the letter. A gas station off Route 17, 3 towns away, where she had filled up her car every other weekend. It wasn't a place for socializing, just a small, lonely station, with a single fluorescent light that flickered in the evening, and a vending machine that always ate your dollar. But it was there, according to the clerk who had worked the night shift back then, that she met him. He didn't remember her name, but when shown her photograph, his brow furrowed. He nodded slowly, almost reluctantly. Yes, he'd seen her, more than once. And yes, she used to talk to a man while she waited for her tank to fill. The man's name, the clerk recalled, might have been Caleb, or maybe Clay. He wasn't sure. But he remembered the car, a black El Camino, older, loud engine, always parked slightly crooked. The driver was older than her, by at least a decade, maybe more. Always in sunglasses, even at night, sometimes wore a hat. Spoke in a calm, almost rehearsed way, like someone who measured each word before releasing it. The revelation was both a breakthrough and a wound. It meant Melanie had kept a secret, not just from her parents, but from everyone. The girl who had seemed so anchored, so careful, had been drifting into something no one saw coming. She'd found someone who made her feel seen in a way high school never could. But he hadn't been who he claimed to be. And the letter hinted at that realization, the creeping awareness that she'd misjudged him. That what once felt like freedom was starting to feel like a trap. There were no photos of them together. No social media to search through. This was 1999, before digital footprints became unavoidable. Caleb was a ghost, and Melanie had helped him stay invisible. But she had left a shadow behind, just enough for someone to follow. Her friends were stunned. They had assumed she'd been alone. That whatever had happened that night was spontaneous, senseless. But now, a different narrative emerged, one of grooming, of manipulation. Of quiet meetings at the edge of town under the hum of gas station lights. Melanie hadn't vanished by chance. She had been led away. Willingly at first, then fearfully, then not at all. The yearbook held no trace of him. He wasn't a student. He wasn't on the guest list for prom. But Melanie had written his name once, in ink, in a letter she likely knew would outlive her, Caleb. The man no one mentioned. The one who started it all. The plan, as pieced together through Melanie's letter and a scattering of witness accounts, had been simple. She would drive her Civic to a park and ride just off the interstate. Leave it there under the glow of overhead lights. And meet Caleb, if that was even his real name, in his car. They would leave town together, start fresh, disappear into a life she believed would be hers. She'd packed a bag, a small one, nothing dramatic. Just a change of clothes, her sketchbook, a few photographs. She left her wallet behind, almost like she wanted to erase the paper trail of who she had been. But she never reached the park and ride. Witnesses later came forward, drawn by the news coverage that reignited the case. One was a night shift janitor from a storage facility that backed up to the wooded edge of the lot where Melanie was supposed to leave her car. He remembered seeing a vehicle idling near the entrance that night. Not hers, but a different one. An older model, low to the ground. He remembered the distinctive lines of the car, the chrome flashing under the dull orange parking lights. It was, he said with certainty, a black El Camino. The man hadn't thought much of it at the time. He assumed it belonged to someone waiting to pick up a friend, or maybe someone sleeping off a long drive. But after hearing the name Melanie Whitaker again, after seeing her photo on the evening news for the first time in a decade, something in his memory stirred. The car had been parked facing the highway, engine running. And when he passed by again 20 minutes later, it was gone. Just like that, as if it had never been there at all. Others began to recall similar details. A waitress working the late shift at a diner just across from the park and ride remembered a girl matching Melanie's description, standing by a Civic, looking around like she was waiting for someone. She didn't come in. She just lingered under the flickering light post, arms crossed, occasionally checking her watch. The waitress said she looked nervous, not afraid, but anxious. And then, just as suddenly, she was gone too. Police searched for the El Camino, of course. Once it became the focus, Once the skeleton in the Civic connected back to the name in the letter, it became the ghost they chased. But there was no record of the vehicle ever being stopped in town, no tickets, no surveillance from gas stations or toll booths. The plates, if they had been visible at all, weren't documented. It was a vehicle that passed through the edge of one life and into the void. The El Camino became the symbol of what had gone wrong. It was the vessel that carried her from a moment of hope into a night that never ended. It was the car that swallowed her, figuratively, if not literally, and drove away with the last chance of safety she had. To this day, it has never been found. Not in neighboring counties, not across state lines. If it's out there, it's buried in a garage somewhere, its paint chipped, its plates long changed. Or perhaps it's already scrap, crushed and melted down, indistinguishable from every other relic of that year. But for those who remember, who stood on the same street where her Civic sat untouched for 10 years, the image of that black El Camino idling beneath sodium lights is more than a detail. It's the question that still has no answer. The vehicle that never should have been forgotten. The other car that was never found. The footage was grainy, the kind that flickers in black and white like an old home movie left too long in the Sunday. Pulled from an outdated traffic camera mounted above a blinking intersection, it was barely usable by modern standards. But to investigators reopening Melanie Whitaker's case, it was everything. The timestamp read 7:41 p.m. May 15, 1999. In the bottom corner of the frame, a car passed by compact, light-colored, and unmistakably a 1996 Honda Civic. Her car, her taillights were the last part of her anyone saw alive. What struck the detectives wasn't that the car had been seen, that alone was a miracle, given the gaps in technology from that time, but where it had been. That intersection didn't lead toward the park and ride lot, where Melanie was supposedly meeting Caleb. It led the other way, toward the edge of town, where paved roads gave way to gravel and then to dust. It led to a place no 17-year-old would end up by accident. The old McAllister orchard, abandoned and rotting behind a rusted gate, untouched for years. Why she went there was a question the footage couldn't answer, but it painted a picture that the letter only hinted at. She hadn't been lured in some random act of violence. She had been directed by someone she trusted. Perhaps Caleb told her to change the plan. Perhaps he convinced her they'd be safer there, out of sight. Maybe he said he'd explain everything when they met. Whatever it was, she believed him. Enough to steer her car away from where she'd told no one she was going. Enough to drive into the dark. The orchard had once been beautiful. Rows of apple trees, stretching in long, perfect lines, with white blossoms that blanketed the fields each spring. But by 1999, it had been left to ruin. Trees had grown wild, their branches gnarled and hungry, and the wooden fence that once surrounded the property had collapsed in places, inviting weeds and vandals and silence. Local kids told stories about it, dares to go in after sunset, claims that it was haunted, but no one ever stayed long. Something about the place made you feel watched. When the police returned to that spot a decade later, guided by that brief glimpse of taillights, the orchard was even more overgrown. The road leading to it was barely passable. But down a narrow trail, half covered in leaves and debris, they found what they didn't know they were looking for. Faint indentations in the earth, the suggestion of tires once turning, once stopping. Not fresh, not even recent, but different from the rest of the ground. Different enough to raise eyebrows. And then they found the remnants of a crushed cigarette pack, a rusted bottle cap, and a zipper fragment embedded in the soil. None of it was conclusive, but it added another layer to the night's unfolding tragedy. Melanie had driven away from her home full of belief in the person waiting for her. She had changed her route without telling anyone because she thought she was headed toward a future. She didn't know she was driving straight into the last place she'd ever see. That detour, those final minutes behind the wheel, the radio likely humming something soft, the windows cracked open to the night air, became the border between her life and its undoing. And though the image from the traffic cam lasted only a few seconds, it held a weight that lingered. Two taillights, receding into the distance, heading toward the orchard. A girl with hope in her chest and no idea she was already being erased. The orchard had always carried an eerie stillness, even in its prime. Long before it became a patch of wilderness and rot, there had been something hushed about the way the wind moved through the trees. They're too soft, too deliberate, like it knew secrets no one else did. After it was abandoned, that quiet turned heavy. Locals started calling it haunted, mostly in jest, but it didn't take much for stories to take root. A dare to go in after dark. Whispers of strange figures seen between the trees. A rustle in the branches when the air was still. It became a place people avoided without ever saying why. When investigators returned in the late summer of 2009, armed with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar, the orchard met them with the same oppressive silence. No birdsong, no breeze. Just the crunch of boots on dry leaves and the occasional static crackle of a walkie-talkie. It had been 10 years since Melanie was last seen, and though the orchard had aged, the ghosts within it had never really settled. The team moved methodically, starting from the overgrown trail where Melanie's car had likely turned off. There were remnants of past visits, beer cans bleached by the sun, broken glass hidden in the grass, faded candy wrappers crumbling like old paper. But deeper in, beneath layers of earth and time, they found something different. Tire treads. Shallow and fragmented, but unmistakable. A distinct pattern, worn in a way that matched the tires still attached to the green Civic that had sat in her driveway for a decade. They measured the spacing, the depth, the radius of the curve as the vehicle had turned in. Melanie had driven in, yes, that much was now certain. What wasn't clear was if she'd ever driven out. Near the center of the orchard, a cluster of trees stood more densely packed. There, beneath a patch of bramble and deadfall, they uncovered a shallow depression in the ground. Not a grave too wide and irregular, but something had once been there. A tarp, perhaps, or some kind of temporary cover. Soil analysis showed disturbances consistent with the weight of two people, possibly seated or crouching. Not enough to determine exactly what happened, just enough to know that something did. They kept digging. Beneath a tangle of roots, an old, rusted keychain emerged, a plastic charm in the shape of a crescent moon, cracked and sun-faded. Melanie had worn a necklace with the same symbol in her school photo. Further down, they found a strip of faded fabric, black, with tiny silver beads stitched into the seam. It might have been from a dress shirt or a prom gown sleeve. Impossible to say for sure. But it was something more than silence. Still, the orchard offered no answers. It gave pieces, hints, suggestions, but nothing whole. It had swallowed what it was told to. And now, like a reluctant witness, it revealed just enough to keep the investigation alive, but never enough to end it. And so the orchard remained as it always had been. Quiet, overgrown, watchful. A place where time collected in the shadows. Where a girl once came, hopeful and scared, driving towards someone she believed would protect her. And where the earth itself still seemed to hold its breath, unwilling to tell the whole truth. The call came in quietly, like most things tied to Melanie Whitaker did. A name written down on a message pad, passed to an officer mid-shift, nearly lost in the stack of callbacks. It was from a woman living 2 towns over, a retired school librarian named Eleanor Briggs. She had seen the recent news coverage, the discovery of the remains, the envelope, the resurgence of attention around Melanie's disappearance. Something about it pulled at her. Not just the tragedy, but a detail she couldn't shake loose. A memory, dim but persistent. She believed she had once seen Melanie in the school library, weeks before prom, checking out a particular book. The kind of book most 17-year-olds wouldn't be interested in. The kind of book no one asked for unless they had a reason. She was right. The records, dusty and barely legible, were stored in a filing cabinet Eleanor hadn't touched in years. But there it was. Melanie Whitaker, signed in blue ink, had checked out a title on the 27th of April, 1999. Vanishing with Intent, a psychological exploration of disappearances. The kind of obscure nonfiction that had no business sitting on a high school shelf, likely donated years ago and long forgotten. It was due 2 weeks later. It was never returned. The book itself had been missing until now. Recovered from a storage box Eleanor had taken with her when she retired, tucked between stacks of outdated textbooks and forgotten yearbooks. It was worn, its cover soft at the edges from handling. When investigators opened it, pages fluttered with the stiffness of age and something more. A folded note, pressed between chapters 4 and 5, had been flattened by time, but still held its shape. It wasn't an official part of the text. It was on lined paper, the corner torn, the handwriting sharp and slanted. It read, "Meet me where no one's watching." No signature, no date. Just those 7 words, hovering between intention and warning. The placement in the book couldn't have been random. Chapter 4 was titled, "The Mechanics of Disappearance," a detailed exploration of the psychological motivations behind planned vanishings. It discussed staged escapes, false leads, the intricacies of eluding detection in a pre-digital world. The note had been hidden precisely at that point, as if it were meant to be found later. Or perhaps, as if it had been handed off through the book itself and exchanged unnoticed by anyone else. The handwriting was compared to the letter addressed to Melanie's mother. Forensic analysts couldn't be conclusive, but the flow of the letters, the way the W and where, curled sharply. The tension in the final G of watching suggested a different author. Not Melanie, someone else. Likely male. Likely older. It shifted everything. Melanie hadn't just been seduced by the idea of leaving. She had been led. The book, the note, the secrecy, it painted a picture of someone orchestrating her isolation, slowly peeling her away from the people who knew her best. It wasn't rebellion. It was grooming. And now, the library book became another piece of evidence. Another whisper from the past echoing into the present. Tucked between forgotten pages, passed through quiet hands, the note waited. A message scribbled not in panic, but in certainty. It was never meant to be loud. It was meant to be heard only by her. And in the end, it was. For years, Jacob Whitaker remained silent. Not out of indifference, but because silence was safer. He had been 12 when his sister disappeared. Old enough to notice things, too young to understand them. The house he grew up in was never the same after that. May evening, its walls drawn tight with tension, its rooms hollowed out by the absence of her voice. He learned early how to exist without asking questions. His parents didn't talk about Melanie after the first year. Her name became something brittle, something that cracked the air whenever it was spoken. So Jacob buried what he remembered, let it drift to the far corners of his mind like dust gathering in untouched spaces. But when the news broke, when the car was opened, when the skeleton was named, those memories didn't stay hidden. They rose like smoke. The first one came back with a smell, his sister's perfume, something light, floral, barely there. He remembered it lingering in the hallway after she passed. She'd started wearing it the spring of her senior year. He never asked why. She hadn't worn perfume before that. But something about her changed around that time. In his first interview with investigators, Jacob sat quietly for a long time before speaking. His voice cracked when he finally did. He said he remembered the week before she vanished. She had started locking the bathroom door when she showered, something she'd never done before. He remembered one night in particular. Their parents had gone to a fundraiser. He had been sitting on the floor in the hallway with a bowl of cereal, playing with his Game Boy, when he heard her crying. He didn't knock, he just waited. When the door finally opened, Melanie stepped out, her eyes red, a towel wrapped around her hair, and something clutched tightly in her hand. A small object, palm-sized, that she shoved into the pocket of her hoodie as soon as she saw him. He asked what was wrong. She told him nothing. He asked what she was holding. She didn't answer. That same night, she sat on the edge of his bed after he'd crawled under the covers. He remembered her smoothing the blanket flat over his legs, then looking at him like she wanted to say something more. Like there was a weight pressing on her chest that she couldn't name. He asked if she was okay. She nodded. Then she said the last words he'd ever hear from her. "Don't follow me." At the time, he didn't think much of it. He thought she was joking, playing big sister. But later, after the police came, after her room became a museum of what once was, those words looped through his head like a warning he hadn't understood in time. "Don't follow me." He began to think maybe she knew something was coming. That she'd made a choice, or thought she had, and didn't want anyone else to get caught in its wake. Jacob said he still dreams of her. Not as the missing girl, not as the skeleton in the trunk, but as the sister who used to braid his hair when their parents weren't looking, who read him stories with flashlight shadows dancing on the wall. In the dreams, she never speaks. She just stands in the hallway, holding something in her hand. The shape is always blurred, always out of reach. And when he wakes, that scent, faint, floral, still lingers in the air. It had been just over a year since the trunk was opened when the first real break in the case arrived, not in town, not even in state, but hundreds of miles away in a holding cell in western Arkansas. The man's name was Grant Elwood, 42 years old, arrested after neighbors reported screams coming from a small trailer on the outskirts of town. The charge was domestic battery, but it wasn't his first. His record stretched back 2 decades: assault, stalking, violation of protective orders. His mugshot showed a man prematurely aged by rage and cigarette smoke. A deep scar split the edge of his brow, the kind that doesn't come from accidents. He wasn't particularly remarkable. Not until they checked the vehicle he'd been driving. Parked outside the trailer, half hidden under a blue tarp, was a black 1982 El Camino, dented, rusted in places, but unmistakable in its lines. The engine still ran. The plates were fake. Inside the glove compartment, officers found a false registration, a box cutter, and a weathered photograph of a young woman in a prom dress cut from a newspaper article. The edges were curled. Someone had traced around her face with a fingertip enough times to wear down the ink. It was enough to trigger a deeper look. The vehicle matched the description that had surfaced during the renewed investigation into Melanie's disappearance. Low, black, often parked near the gas station where she was last seen alone. The same car described by the janitor near the park and ride. The same one a waitress had remembered watching disappear into the night. It was a ghost vehicle until now. And now, it had a driver. When investigators contacted Arkansas authorities, they requested a DNA sample. It was processed against a single strand of hair recovered from the backseat of Melanie's Civic. A strand found beneath the floor mat, too fine to be hers. 10 years old, degraded, but not worthless. The lab confirmed a partial match. Not enough for a conviction. Not even enough for an arrest, but enough to reclassify Grant Elwood from anonymous suspect to person of extreme interest. Interviews followed. Elwood was quiet at first. He denied ever being in Ohio, said he'd never heard of Melanie Whitaker, claimed he'd bought the El Camino from someone in Missouri 5 years prior. But there were gaps in his timeline, jobs unaccounted for, residences he couldn't name. He had a habit of disappearing for stretches of time and reappearing in different states under different aliases. He was a drifter, but one with a pattern, always working just under the table, always attached to younger women, always leaving just before something went wrong. When shown the photo of Melanie, Elwood paused. Just for a second. A flicker of something, a glint in the eye, a shift in breath. He said no. But the investigators knew what they saw. Still, it wasn't enough. The case that had once gone cold was warm again, but fragile. They had a car, a man, and a match that fell just short of damning. But it was a beginning. The first time in over a decade that the name Melanie Whitaker stood beside something resembling justice. The El Camino had finally reappeared. And with it, the man who may have driven a 17-year-old girl into the dark and never looked back. Grant Elwood's voice never wavered. From the moment investigators sat him down, he denied it all. No, he had never been to Ohio. No, he didn't know anyone named Melanie Whitaker. No, he had never driven that particular El Camino before 2004, and even then, it had been bought secondhand with cash from a stranger at a roadside swap meet in Kansas. He answered every question with a kind of calm defiance, as though the accusations were beneath him, like this was just another minor inconvenience he would eventually leave behind. But as they began pulling apart his timeline, the threads started to unravel. They started with what he had volunteered. He'd said he was living in Louisiana in 1999, working in construction off the books, no W-2, no paper trail. But when they tracked down the company he'd claimed to work for, there was no record of him. No pay stubs, no sign-in logs, nothing. The address he gave for his residence turned out to be a condemned house slated for demolition the year prior. And when pressed, he couldn't provide a single name of a co-worker, landlord, or friend who could place him anywhere in the South during that spring. What they did find was a fuel receipt nearly faded to illegibility buried deep in the glove box of the El Camino. Dated May 15, 1999. The very night Melanie disappeared. It was from a gas station just 30 miles from her hometown. Paid in cash, but the location was clear. Elwood couldn't explain it. Claimed the receipt must have come from the previous owner. Insisted he had never been near that town. But the dates were stacking against him. Then came the phone records. Investigators pulled every burner number connected to Elwood during that decade, tracing their limited activity. One, registered briefly under a false name in Illinois, had pinged off a cell tower near the county line of Melanie's hometown around 6 p.m. on the night she vanished. The same tower covered the stretch of highway where her car was later spotted on the grainy traffic cam. It was a sliver of proof, but it was enough to cast doubt on everything he claimed. Still, it was circumstantial. And Elwood knew it. He sat through hours of questioning with a blank expression, the kind that floats just above smirking. He had lived like this for years on the fringes, untethered, undocumented. He knew how to avoid leaving footprints, but people leave fingerprints even when they think they don't. The final piece came from an unlikely place. A former classmate of Melanie's going through an old shoebox of high school memorabilia after seeing her name in the news again. Among the Polaroids and flyers was a photo, unmarked, half torn at the edge. It showed Melanie sitting at an outdoor table, a milkshake in front of her, smiling. Next to her, arm draped casually across her shoulders, was a man, not a student. Not anyone from school. Older, sunglasses. A baseball cap pulled low. But the jawline, the scar over the left brow, the shape of the hand resting on Melanie's arm, it was him, Grant Elwood. The investigators showed him the photo. For the first time, he didn't speak. His eyes narrowed just slightly. His mouth twitched. Then he leaned back in the chair and looked away. The timeline he clung to had cracked. And through the fracture, the truth began to seep. The letter Melanie left behind was short, no more than a few paragraphs, but it was dense with unspoken truths. Lines that trembled between apology and confession, between longing and fear. To her mother, it might have seemed like a farewell. To investigators, it was something darker. A breadcrumb trail through the interior of a girl who had been quietly unraveling. Melanie hadn't simply run away. She had been cornered. Pushed toward the margins of her own life by someone who convinced her she was safer in the shadows than in the light. The hints were subtle. She never named him more than once, and even then only by first name Caleb. But in between the lines, there was something insidious. She mentioned how he didn't like to be doubted, how he hated when I made him feel small. She wrote that he once told her she was too young to understand how the world works, and that she needed him to be safe in it. She'd begun to believe him. Not because it made sense, but because it had been said enough times to feel like fact. Her parents had chalked up the changes in her to adolescence. She had always been thoughtful, a little withdrawn, often lost in her books or her drawings. But in the weeks leading up to prom, there was something more than the typical emotional distance. She would flinch when the phone rang. She stopped taking the bus and instead asked for rides, often from people who couldn't remember whether she actually got in or not. Once, her father found her sitting on the front porch well past midnight. Fully dressed but unmoving, staring at the mailbox. When he asked what she was doing, she said only, "Just thinking." They had grounded her once for coming home hours late. No call, no explanation. She'd simply walked in around 1 a.m. Pale and quiet, her clothes damp from the evening fog. Her mother had yelled. Her father had paced the kitchen, angry more from fear than frustration. Melanie didn't fight back. She didn't argue. She just took the grounding without a word and went to her room. They thought she was being defiant. But what they didn't know, what they could never have imagined, was that she had spent those hours sitting in Caleb's car, afraid to get out, afraid to ask him to take her home, afraid of what he might do if she said the wrong thing. He had a way of making every choice seem like hers. A manipulation so gentle it never felt like force. He'd remind her that no one else understood her. That if she left, if she told, she'd be the one in trouble. That her parents would never forgive her. That her friends would turn on her. And somewhere along the way, Melanie began to believe that the only path forward was through him. Not around him, not away from him. Through him. She was scared, yes, but more than that, she was ashamed. She had let him too far in, trusted him too much, and by the time she realized it, she didn't know how to undo it without losing everything. So she didn't speak. She kept the fear tucked behind her smiles. She wrote it down instead. In her journal, in her margins. In one final letter, addressed to her mother that never made it to the kitchen table. And when she left on the night of prom, she didn't do so with hope. She did so with resignation. With the crushing silence of someone who'd tried to ask for help in 100 quiet ways and never found the words loud enough to break through. Her parents never knew. Not until it was too late. The truth, when it finally emerged, did not come as a single revelation but as a slow, grinding unearthing. Each fragment fitting into place until the shape of horror could no longer be denied. The testimonies of the two survivors, when placed against the backdrop of the compound and the evidence recovered, revealed a narrative so bleak that even the most skeptical investigators could not look away. The children had not simply vanished into the forest that day. In 2007, they had been taken deliberately, absorbed into a hidden community that lived by rules, incomprehensible to the outside world. They were raised not as students, not as children, but as possessions. The survivors spoke of indoctrination that began almost immediately. They were told their families had abandoned them, that the world beyond the trees was poisoned and hostile, that only within the compound could they be safe. The sect members became their new guardians, though guardianship was twisted into control. The children were given lessons not in mathematics or history, but in obedience, in ritual, in the belief that they were part of a cycle where suffering was necessary for renewal. They learned to repeat chants, to bow their heads when commanded, to silence their own questions under the weight of fear. For some, the pressure was unbearable. Illness spread easily in the damp rooms of the compound, and those who grew too weak were taken away. The survivors recalled how the group would whisper the names of the vanished at night, only to be punished if caught. Others perished during what the sect called offerings, ceremonies conducted in the dark, where the children were forced to watch and believe that death was transformation. The lines between memory and nightmare blurred in the survivors' recounting, but the consistency of their fear was undeniable. Perhaps most harrowing was the silence enforced among them. To speak of the world outside was forbidden. To cry for their parents was punished. To remember too loudly was dangerous. Their voices were stripped from them until the only language left was the one given by the sect, a language of submission and secrecy. It was this enforced silence that explained why, for so many years, no word had reached the world beyond the forest. Even when chances arose, even when fragments of escape seemed possible, the children had been bound by terror too deep to overcome. What made the truth even more unbearable was the realization that fragments of it had been visible all along, buried beneath negligence and indifference. Reports of cult activity had circulated for decades. Strange gatherings had been noted by locals, fires seen in the woods, rumors of children kept apart from society. Yet again and again, the authorities had dismissed them as folklore, unwilling or unable to devote resources to something so intangible. When the children vanished, those early warnings were never tied together, and in the chaos of the initial search, the possibility of organized abduction was shelved as implausible. Power played its role as well. Individuals with influence ensured that questions about the sect were buried, files misplaced, attention redirected. The truth that surfaced 18 years later was not only about the children's fate, but about the failure of those entrusted to protect them. Many had died in captivity, their names carved into the compound walls, serving as their only epitaph. Some had survived, grown into adults in hiding, their silence bought by fear that the sect's reach was not gone but only waiting. And those who had once had the authority to intervene had looked away, dismissing whispers as paranoia, choosing order over truth. For the families, the revelations were a wound opened anew. Their children had not been lost to chance but to cruelty, to a system that thrived in shadows because no one dared shine a light. To know that so much suffering had unfolded so close, hidden only by trees and indifference, was a truth too heavy to carry without breaking. Yet it was the truth, undeniable, carved into wood and spoken through trembling voices. The shocking reality was not simply that the children had been taken. It was that they had been forced into silence, their voices muted not only by the cult but by a world unwilling to hear. They had been sacrificed to belief, to secrecy, to neglect. And though fragments of them had returned, the story remained incomplete. Haunted by the many who never emerged from the forest, their fate sealed in shadows that no investigation could fully dispel. The truth was no longer hidden, but it was not closure. It was a revelation that burned, that accused, that left scars deeper than mystery ever had. The orchard, once a place of whispered dares and forgotten stories, changed after they found her. Where there had been overgrowth and silence, there was now a clearing. Not carved by machines or city orders, but by human hands, neighbors with pruning shears, teachers who remembered her face, strangers who couldn't quite explain why they felt compelled to help. At the center of the clearing, where the trees broke just enough for sunlight to bleed through, a simple wooden bench was placed. It was sanded smooth, pale in color, and engraved with just 5 words, "In memory of Melanie Whitaker." There was no ceremony. Not officially. The town hadn't earned one. But they came anyway, one by one, over days, weeks. Some brought flowers. Others left corsages, their ribbons faded, petals pressed beneath stones so the wind wouldn't carry them away. A few brought photos, taped gently to the nearby trunks. Senior pictures, group shots from pep rallies. Melanie laughing in the corner of a frame, half hidden by someone else's arm. Most people didn't speak. They just stood for a while, as if trying to apologize to a girl who no longer had ears to hear it. Someone left a cassette player, old and dented, its batteries wrapped in foil to keep them from slipping out. Tucked inside was a mixtape labeled Prom 2099. When the play button was pressed, the speaker crackled to life, and then a familiar tune floated through the trees. "If you're lost, You can look, and you will find me. The voice was soft, distant, worn by time, but unmistakable. Cyndi Lauper's Time After Time. It echoed through the orchard like a ghost's lullaby, mournful and tender. The kind of song meant for slow dances and last goodbyes. No one knew who brought it. No one needed to. A few weeks later, Melanie's remains were laid to rest in the town cemetery, beneath a modest headstone etched with a crescent moon. The service was small, just family, a few old classmates, her high school principal, now retired. Her brother stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, watching the breeze stir the grass. He had brought one of her lipstick notes, folded carefully in his jacket. On it, she had written, "Maybe we get more than one chance, maybe not." The town itself began to shift after that. Slowly, subtly, the silence that had once blanketed Primrose Lane lifted. People spoke her name again, not as a mystery, but as a memory. Melanie. A girl who should have had a future. A girl who had tried to find one on her own. At the high school, a new English teacher assigned a unit on storytelling through silence and metaphor. The library added a shelf of books about missing girls and the quiet power of being believed. And near the orchard, the memorial grew. Someone left a sketchbook, its pages filled with images of flight birds, open skies, a girl in a dress running toward a horizon she would never reach. Someone else hung a wind chime from a low branch. When the breeze moves just right, it sings softly through the clearing, a song only the trees can carry. Melanie Whitaker, who never made it to prom, had finally made it home. Not through the return of her body, but through the return of her voice. In notes, in drawings, in the pieces she left behind, and in the hearts of a town that remembered but far too late. Hook. In 1999, a girl's car sat untouched in her driveway while her prom dress hung waiting in the window. 10 years later, when they opened that car's trunk, the truth shattered everything her town thought they knew.